Meet us in the yard. We got the guards, including the Sarge, only on with our hearts, but we need to talk. We got demands. Die like a man, last resort of our plan. Gotta meet us in the yard. We got the guards, including the Sarge, only on with our hearts, but we need to talk. We got demands. Die like a man, last resort of our plan. First thing we need is amnesty for this calamity. Can you guarantee that we make it home to our families? Inhumanity is the lens in which you branded me.
Okay, I'm Emily Goodman, and I was one of the Attica lawyers beginning in 1971 till now. Of course, the whole world was focused on Attica following the California events and George Jackson leading up to Attica. And so from September 9th, 10th, those days, you couldn't really avoid paying attention to what was happening, but I don't think anybody really understood what was happening. And then on the 13th, I happened to be at the Lawyers Guild office when a call came from one of the observers, who was Bill Kunstler, and he said, something is going to happen, this place is going to explode, and lawyers and doctors will be needed. And a few of us decided we had to go. And we got on the next plane from LaGuardia to Buffalo, and we were there a few hours later. And so that was the beginning of the legal team, really. And I'm sure we didn't know what to expect. Of course, a certain picture was being painted if you need lawyers and doctors, but I don't think anyone could imagine what was actually happening or would shortly happen shortly. So that was the beginning, and a group of us arrived at Buffalo. We went to the law school, and there we met with Herman Schwartz, who was teaching at the law school and was affiliated with the ACLU. And as a team, the plan was to go to Wyoming County, where Attica Correctional Facility is located. But it was decided first that we should get some kind of order to enter the prison and see our clients. We didn't actually have clients, but we would need to have some kind of standing to show up. And so the papers were drawn up, and to give lawyers access to their clients who were inmates at Attica. And eventually we drove to the prison in kind of a caravan of cars. And the way I remember it is kind of an excitement that we had actually achieved the first goal, which was to get a court order. And we kind of thought that was a big victory. But we were stopped at roadblocks along the way. And when we finally got close to the area, we began to understand that it was not going to be easy. But there was an argument that, but we have a court order. And the first person who stopped us said, well, you got a court order, but I've got a bayonet. And that was very intimidating. And that was, I think, for me, the first realization that we had nothing. And yet most of us were kind of baby lawyers, some a little more senior. But we'd gone to law school, and we pretty much believed in a court order. And so that was a shock that a court order was going to be ignored. We were not going to get into to see our clients. It wasn't a question of who exactly are your clients. That didn't matter. But we did get onto what they call the campus, but not the buildings. And we just kind of stood there, paralyzed. I mean, we didn't know what to do. We weren't really afraid for ourselves, but we were getting the picture of what was going on because we could hear things. We could hear what we understood to be guns, and I was certainly not familiar with that. I didn't really know what gunshots were, but when you hear them, you do know. And there were other people there too, but mostly they were the families of guards, so they weren't necessarily friendly to us if they realized who we were. But we kept thinking, well, we're going to get in, but we stood there all night in the rain. By the time we got there, it was dark out, and so we stood there. There was a coffee truck, which was really not for us. It was for the families of the so-called hostages, and I think it was the Red Cross or the Salvation Army. Some do-good organization, and we stood there really helpless. We were completely helpless, and eventually it was morning, and we were still standing there, and that's when the medical examiner came out and stood on a staircase, and I was very close to him, to the staircase and to the medical examiner, when he announced that all of the bullets were state-sponsored weapons. And the reporter, there were a lot of reporters there, and everybody started with questions, but the questions made it very clear, not as clear it would eventually be, but we understood what was going on. And it was much worse than I think anyone really imagined. But we had no direct evidence of anything at that point. So that's all the first day. Well, it's the fourth day of the uprising, but it's the first day of the rest of the story of Attica. They want to know how many dead, how many bullets, how many guards were dead. Questions about the so-called hostages, the basic facts. And they weren't what was previously being fed to the public, even a few hours earlier. That the inmates were had seized hostages. They were killing them. They would be that the dead would be hostages, not that the dead were going to be the prisoners, because remember, nobody thought that Rockefeller would actually do this, if only because of his own ambition to become president. I guess he misread the situation and thought this would help him become president someday, but that is clearly not what happened. So we felt kind of that we were surrounded. We were in enemy territory. I had no sense of danger to myself personally, but we were in a war zone, really. And I remember that night, still in Buffalo, and we must have, we were in kind of a bar, and I used a phone booth to call New York, and I called my parents, and my father said that he heard on the news about Attica, and he said, "I'm surprised you didn't go there." And I didn't say I was there. I said, "Oh, I was just calling to see, how everybody is." So I realized that he anticipated that I would want to be there if I could be there. And in fact, I didn't mention till I came back that I had been there for that period. Oh, I forgot to say that when we were on the road and being stopped at these various checkpoints, that one of the lawyers called the judge to say, well, they're not letting us in, they're not honoring the order, and asking the judge to intervene. Like the judge would make a phone call and say you're all in contempt or something. And the judge said no, he wouldn't do anything, and we'll see you in court the next appearance, which was then scheduled, but the judge was not going to put his power behind his order. So it was a very life-changing thing for everybody. Obviously, for the people who suffered the most, but I think also for the lawyers. Most of us were pretty young, and well, no one at any age had encountered anything like this. I mean, nobody was in an actual war, and so it was a revelation. You go to law school and you think that you approach things in a certain way, and they will develop in a certain way, and there'll be a court and a judge and an order, and then maybe justice will be done. But that was, I think, such a vivid shock that he said, "You have a court order, I have a bayonet, and you can't argue that a piece of paper." When I say we, I'm really speaking for myself, but I think everybody did have the same reaction, that we believed in the power of a piece of paper, and then saw that it was kind of worthless. I was 2 years out of law school, so I was almost 30, but I hadn't hadn't experienced anything like this. Of course, everybody had been to demonstrations and conflicts, but this was really a war zone, and there were actual enemies. And that was the whole process. But that night was unlike anything most of us, all of us, have ever experienced then or until now, certainly on that scale. I mean, we know of murders, we know of police encounters with people in the streets, but this was unique. People started coming up to Buffalo, and eventually getting into the prison. Our group left after a few days, and we were replaced by other people. The civil litigation came later. but there was, well, I actually, along with one of the other lawyers, eventually got to appear before the grand jury, which was very unusual. And I was with Jonathan Lubell. I don't know if his name has come up in anything, and Jonathan died a couple of years ago. I don't think he was with us on the original trip on the 13th, but somehow we got to see the grand jury, and when that was eventually convened, and that was a very odd experience because you don't usually get to see the grand jury. And so amongst the lawyers, really strange things would happen. Like there would be a discussion of how to act as lawyers, and there was controversy about it because some of the lawyers felt, well, we should be down with the brothers, and we shouldn't act like lawyers, and we shouldn't look like lawyers, and people shouldn't dress like lawyers when we have to go to court, or in that case, the grand jury, because that's a class thing and we're with them. And others of us felt, no, we have to do everything we can to be professional. And it sounds kind of trivial now, but it was a big issue about are we lawyers or are we part of Attica as principals? And I think the way I remember it, people decided to, well, wear whatever you want, but the brothers said, no, I want my lawyer. I want the best possible representation, and I don't want my lawyer to aggravate the judge or, you know, be disrespectful to the court. So it was a small thing, but a funny thing that represented what was a conflict in how people analyzed what was happening. And the grand jurors, when we did get in there, and I don't know how we managed to do that, and you know, they were like country people. I don't think, how can I say this without, this sounding like a class analysis, but they didn't look like a New York City grand jury. They looked like country people, and most of them were in some sort of relationship with corrections people, husbands, sons, brothers. You know, it's Wyoming County, and everybody's part of the prison system then and now too. So some months later, well, different lawyers were going up and back because people had obligations in the city too. So we would kind of relieve one another, and eventually there were indictments, and I don't know how assignments were made, who would have what case, but so I had indictment number 9, and my client was the first one to get out, and we had a hearing, a bail hearing, really. Of course, no one had money, but we had a bail hearing, and he was released on, I guess it was an unsecured personal bond, and the sweetest thing happened, because people in the courtroom, who we didn't necessarily know, but there might have been some people who were part of the larger Attica group, people just started passing money in a hat for him, realizing he had he had whatever clothes he had, and he was going to be released, and so that he could get home. Well, I had, I guess, plane tickets. Oh, that's another thing. When we first went to Attica on the 13th, and we were all going to meet when the first possible plane would be leaving for Buffalo. But in those days, we didn't have money. I mean, it sounds like it was centuries ago. Nobody had a credit card. And I recall that it was $35. I don't know if that was round trip or one way from New York to Buffalo. And the only person who had a credit card was Haywood Burns. And that was very sophisticated, though it doesn't seem, it seems that in our lifetimes people had credit cards, but no, not one of us could actually pay the fare to get to Buffalo. Somehow, well, Haywood had the credit card. What I can tell you and keep telling you is I think for the lawyers, certainly myself, well, we weren't shot, but it's a life-changing event. You could say there's before Attica and after Attica. In my personal case, maybe it's a little odd that I would then, we all continued to be lawyers, as far as I know, in different ways. But I think it's also interesting that I actually went on the bench. But partly in a kind of cynical way, knowing I could do certain things and other people could just ignore them because I saw the value of a court order. But it did make me think that there has to be a better way. And all of us were trying to do public interest law, or something that was in the public interest and the public good. And so then I took that path and always tried for all those years to still be able to do the right thing, and not to succumb to the idea that once you have that little bit of power as a judge, you can change teams. You know, so I always felt that I'm still on, I'm still on the team. I'm still, of course, I couldn't practice law, but that I'm still out there with the others. I'm still with the Attica brothers. I'm not evicting people. I'm not. I found it very difficult on criminal cases. I found it very difficult to sentence people. And one thing that I heard about myself, the court system runs on statistics. Everything's about numbers. One word you never hear in the whole court system is about justice. That is the last thing anybody cares about. And but they keep statistics about everything because how many and humans are not considered and not referred to as humans. In the court, they're bodies. How many bodies were produced in court today? How many bodies are going to Rikers Island? So it's how many bodies have we moved? And so then I found out, after I was in Supreme Court Criminal Division in the Bronx for 2 years, and I found out that I had the best statistic in disposing of cases, of bodies and cases, which I couldn't understand because I was not known as a DA's judge, and quite the opposite. But then it became logical. I realized, and people told me why, and that is when people were, when I was assigned to their case, their lawyers would tell them if you're going to plead guilty, and if you're offered a plea quote bargain, take it now because it will never get any lower. Because I was always with the lowest possible sentence, and you couldn't avoid it because if you decided to go lower, it would be immediately reversed, and so what would be accomplished? But I couldn't bear the punitive aspect in sentencing people. But then too, I also believe in change and new lives. Oh, I think, by the way, about that grand jury, the reason that we were in the grand jury might have had to do with Jerry Rosenberg. Maybe other people have mentioned Jerry Rosenberg, who was also known as Jerry the Jew, and he was a great character, and he believed that he could outsmart everybody. If he was so smart in what in his life, maybe he wouldn't be in this facility. But he wound up there, and believed that he would testify at the grand jury about the whole entire uprising, and that he would outsmart the grand jurors and the prosecutors, and he would be able to figure out from their questions. He would voluntarily be interrogated, and that from their questions he would figure out what their strategies were and so on. Of course, that didn't happen, but I think that's how we got into the grand jury, possibly, because we had no other. And of course, there weren't women, so that part was a little difficult too, dealing not so much the brothers really, but guards, everybody else in the institutions, the courts, and everything. They were not used to seeing women lawyers, and that was not necessarily a very pleasant experience. They weren't used to it in New York either in the early 70s. But it was a little more expected in the Manhattan or the New York City courts than it was up there. One person, I guess Barbara Hanch, who came and stayed and moved to Buffalo and lived there for quite a long time because of Attica. It's very hard to feel, to be a witness or a participant in something so hideous, especially knowing how much you want to make a difference, but how little difference you can make. Now, maybe in the long run, people think, justice was done to some extent, the civil cases and small amounts of money and everything that went into that, with people like Danny Myers and Liz and the others who you know and have spoken to, and the things that Danny Alterman spoke about earlier. I think it's affected all of us in some ways that are very profound. And I think people close to us know that too. My own daughter wasn't even born, and Jared met her. She came to the reading at the Strand, but she knows that there's something very important in my life, and therefore derivatively in hers, whatever it means. To me, it means to her. On the positive side, I think, I met wonderful people. I knew many of the lawyers. I didn't know the brothers then, prior to that time. So many of them are gone, but they were wonderful people in my life. I mean, I've always said as a judge on the civil side, it's more commercial or personal accidents or real estate or something like that. But you meet a much better class of people if you are dealing with the Attica brothers. I would say I've met wonderful people. I'm sorry that so many of them are gone. On the personal side, and I really never talk about this publicly, but I did marry someone on parole, not from Attica. Some of you might know that. And the marriage didn't last, but we were together for a long time. And even though he was the one who served time, I didn't. But I have to say that I felt a kind of affinity for a certain world. And there were friends I had who sort of dropped me. They said, what are you doing with this guy on parole and eventually off parole, who served a lot of time? But it's a certain culture that you can relate to or not relate to. And I have a very emotional tie, I think, to people, well, in general, people who suffer. But people who have suffered the loss of their liberty, and we can all talk for hours, days about how that happened, do have a special place for me. And part of that I do attribute to the experiences of Attica. We are all in this together, and because no one should forget, but the danger is people are forgetting, and things are, this could happen again any day, any time, whether it's in a prison context or anything else. I mean, I happen to think that the political environment we're in is a lot worse now than it was in 1971. I don't mean specifically in Attica, but I mean, the country is going downhill very quickly, I think. I don't know what it will mean that we have this commemoration and video and all the things that we're working on, but there are certain things that we just cannot allow to be forgotten. That this happened, that this is a thing that actually happened in the United States in the 20th century is unbelievable. And Jared's book, I mean, this is no joke. This is not a comic book. This happened. I think they care as much for their clients. I mean, if they're doing that kind of law. But I don't know if younger people feel committed for the long haul. I don't know how. I mean, the civil case went on for how many years? I don't know if young people right now seem to have the stamina and commitment for that kind of uh, uh, undertaking. But I don't really know. I can say in the judiciary, for example, on the state level in New York, I see very few judges coming from what I would consider a progressive background. I see almost no judges coming who have had any connection to the Lawyers Guild or to the issues that our crowd was involved with. I mean, they're much younger. They're very ambitious. Um, but I I don't really see people who would say, um, I am going to do everything I possibly can to make sure nobody gets evicted. I don't I don't see that kind of commitment to the same values that we had. And even in the Lawyers Guild, the younger people are very passionate about certain issues, but I don't. To me, they're not the basic issues of that I care about justice. For example, I'm on a housing listserv, and almost everybody on that does civil poverty law, legal aid, legal services, or various other organizations, and a few people who may do other things, but related to housing justice. And I don't. I only know a handful of people who relate, say, to the Lawyers Guild. But the Lawyers Guild now, there's tremendous interest in things which are okay, but they're not housing. For example, they might be about animal rights and food and other things that are important to everybody. But of course, the Parole Project is a thing unto itself, and that's great. And the Lawyers Guild is a sponsor of this commemoration. So in no way am I saying that the Lawyers Guild isn't, but it's very hard to get the Lawyers Guild younger people interested in, if you don't want to change the judiciary, don't complain about what the judges do, because you're either in or you're out. And people say, oh, that's not so important, which I think it is. So I don't really know how to answer that question about how younger lawyers react or would react. The conflict of realizing that a piece of paper is not a gun. I mean, it's a simple way of putting it. It was a big realization that night that even though we did such good work to get a court order, we were not going to get into the prison. It was known that we were there, and they kept shooting people. So that's a very big change. And I myself had not been. I come from a very working class background, and I never knew any people with money, and yeah, I mean, we always had enough to eat and those basics, but I never knew that I was really in a relatively privileged kind of life, but it was, but I had a fairly deprived life too, and but this was the first time that I had actually seen what can happen to people. Yeah, I went to law school. I knew certain things intellectually, but I hadn't seen what can actually happen. Yeah, I read about war. But it is a different thing when you are there, and this is happening, and people are telling you and showing you they have weapons, and what can happen. And as I said about my view of the law and my role in the law, I already knew the kind of law I was doing, but it's a very defining thing. You are basically on one side or the other. If you're certainly if you're a lawyer. Judges, okay, so you're neutral, and you're, what does Justice Roberts say? You just call balls and strikes. No, that is not true, because it is your job to find the way to do justice. It's not always attainable, but that's the job. So if you're going to take that job or get that job, I don't think there's any room for switching teams or really ambition, because basically you're one of the workers on an assembly line, moving bodies and moving numbers, but you have to know that you're going to find the way to do the right thing. Danny Myers sometimes reminds me, one night in, I guess, 2004, when the Republican convention for presidential convention was in New York at Madison Square Garden, and people were being arrested all over the city and being held on piers on the river. And both Dannys, and a couple of other lawyers came to me with requesting an order to release the people who were being held prisoner. They were arrested. And Liz Fink was there too. And I said, well, let's go to the court. It was the middle of the night. And I'll order the release. And so it was kind of the opposite of what happened that first night in Buffalo, because I felt like I had a personal stake in it too. These people have got to be released. They've been demonstrating because of the Bush. It was the Bush nomination. People were demonstrating, First Amendment, etc. And so I thought, well, it doesn't really matter that it's the middle of the night. We have to go to court and do something. And so in my career, 3 decades on the bench, I thought, well, what's the point of having me there if I'm not going to try my best to be an agent of justice? Because otherwise it doesn't matter who the judges are, and it doesn't really matter who lawyers are, unless their commitment is to more than themselves.
So what happened?
Meet us in the yard, we got the guards, including the Sarge, only on with our hearts, but we need to talk. we got demands. Die like a man, last resort of our plan. Gotta meet us in the yard. We got the guards, including the Sarge, only on with our hearts, but we need to talk. We got demands. Die like a man, last resort of our plan. First thing we need is amnesty for this calamity. Can you guarantee that we make it home to our families? Inhumanity is the lens in which you branded me, expecting different results.